Welcome to the Faster Podcast by FLO Cycling, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything that makes you faster on your bike. This is episode 27, and today we have Canadian cycling coach Steve Neal joining us on the show. Steve has served as the Ontario provincial mountain bike coach and has led many cyclists to national titles. In this episode, we will discuss how working with a personal coach can help you reach your potential. We'll also learn why FTP might not be the best metric for predicting performance. This episode is full of excellent advice on how to become a faster cyclist in all disciplines. If you ride on the pavement or on the dirt, this episode is for you. All right, Steve Neal, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. And you're in Ontario, Canada. Is that correct?
I am in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, sitting there as we speak, finally looking at some sunshine.
I was just going to say, you out of the snow yet, or is it warming up?
And I mean that just recently.
All right. Well, I was born and raised in Canada, so I live in San Diego now. I can say I don't really miss the winters too much. So
I bet you don't.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we wanted to have you on the show today to talk about reaching our athletic potential. And I think a lot of athletes out there who either race or just want to compete with themselves have questioned, how fast can I get? And for a cyclist, that question might be, how high can I get my watts per kilogram number? Or maybe how fast can I ride a 40K TT? So before we talk about that, I want to frame this interview with a few assumptions about what a typical athlete might look like on paper who's listening to this podcast. And I want to do that to give you a point of reference from which you can base the advice that you give us. So let's base the assumption on an average cyclist, and they would look like this. So the average cyclist is riding about 4 to 8 hours per week. They likely experience some interruptions in training due to family, work, illness, or injury. These athletes are following a structured plan that they probably purchased online. Aside from the few interruptions they may experience throughout the year, these cyclists are generally consistent riders who have been training for a year or more. And while they were generally fit, they seem to have hit a watts per kilogram number and have plateaued there for a while. So what I really want this show to be about is, how do we get that last 10% or half of a watt per kilogram of performance? And I think regardless of where the athlete is genetically, the advice that you give us today should apply to anyone listening. So whether they're trying to go from 2.5 watts a kilogram to 3 or 4.5 watts a kilogram to 5, I think the advice that you give us should be pretty general for everybody. So let's start with a first general question for you. Am I correct in my assumption that there is room for improvement left on the table when using a generic program?
Absolutely. I think a lot of what we can talk about today can stem from examples from the business that I own called the Cycling Gym. Okay. Because it's exactly those people minus the generic program. So following your timelines, all of your lists of things that interrupt. Those are the 75 to 100 people we have coming to our gym on a weekly basis, 3 to 5 times a week. So I have lots of examples of that. Okay. I think that yes, a generic program is just that. And what I've always found interesting about generic programming is if you take a really good coach and help a person apply that generic program, the generic program improves. Okay. So sometimes that's just explaining to the athlete, how to do a workout better, how they should feel. And all those things are usually missed in a generic online program. Okay.
And then aside from the generic program, what can a more customized program do, and working with a high-level coach, that a generic program can't? What are some other benefits that an athlete can see by working with a coach who gives them a specific program?
I think I think one of the biggest things is helping an athlete to understand how workouts should feel. In this day and age, we have a lot of power-based programs and programs that are, power is the only way to train. So over the course of the list of things you mentioned above about a normal human being that we're discussing in the podcast, the power that they can produce on a Tuesday in week one of a generic program will be very greatly different from the power able to produce in week three and how that feels because of all the things you mentioned. So having a coach to explain how things should feel while they're still trying to do a workout appropriately, I think can help keep them on track a lot better than just, religiously following something based on a power test.
Okay. So you're not a power only guy. You believe in heart rate and other measures of intensity.
Absolutely. How long do I have on that one? So power, I'll just make a list and you cut me off. So power, cadence, heart rate, respiration, perceived exertion would be my quick list.
All right. I like that. Awesome. Okay. So before we get into a little more about specificity, let's talk or about potential. Let's talk about specificity. So if you look at swimming, some athletes excel at the 50 and the 100, while others excel at the 1500. So those athletes, at the Olympic level or whatever, they've found their potential in a distance that best suits their physiology. So when it comes to cycling, I'm guessing that there are different types of cyclists who perform at shorter events, let's say like a 90-minute cross-country race or a crit, and then ones who do better at a marathon mountain bike race or a 100-mile stage race. Can you confirm that?
Oh, absolutely. I think I don't want to try to talk too much at the wrong time here, but I think that, yeah, absolutely. But those numbers and that information comes from the people that are at the top of the game.
Okay.
And so I'll just say, yes, that is the case.
Okay. And then since that is the case, for athletes who are training themselves or working out, what is the best way for them to determine what distance best suits their physiology?
Well, that's where I need to babble for a little bit.
Go nuts.
Don't mind.
Yeah, please do.
So what happens with regular, because we're the podcast is about regular people with 48 hours a week and have found cycling maybe late in life, or they've been they did it a lot seriously, then they took a big break and they're back at it.
Yep.
A lot of those people choose a discipline in cycling because they just really like it. So
okay.
I've seen just last week I met a guy who was 6'5", 248 pounds, was a very good volleyball player in his time. I mean, very good.
Okay.
And he's taken up he's coached by a person who's won the Barkley Marathon because he wants to do ultra running.
Okay.
So, I'll just tell you right now, if you put him on the sidewalk and said, pick out the ultra runner, he would not ever be on your list.
Right.
But that's what he has chosen as his goal. So then, and that's what I see a lot. I see people that maybe should be riding road, but they love mountain biking. And vice versa. You see all these different disciplines in cycling, gravel races, road races, short road races, stage races, mountain biking. They're all drawing in a lot of different people that maybe aren't suited to the race, but that's what they want to try to do.
Okay.
So that's what I see most of the time is it doesn't matter how many numbers I can show them that say that you want to be a mountain bike stage racer. I really think you should race cyclocross. And they're like, I don't want to do that. I raced cyclocross for 30 years and now I want a mountain bike stage race. So then I spend time trying to allow them to become the best at the goals they've chosen with whom they are.
Okay. So for those athletes who do want to just find their potential and stick with it, can you give us a quick idea of what type of numbers would say, hey, go be a short stage race guy or go be a cyclocross guy?
So I guess this one maybe not be so short. So I generally use a variety of different tools when I'm testing clients.
Yep.
So I use a Metabolic Cart. And I use something called metabolic efficiency testing, which I'm certified in, one of the only people in Canada, if not the only one, actually. And that's, a system by Bob Siebehar out of the States that looks a lot at fueling.
Okay.
So sort of fat and carb, concentrations and how an athlete fuels themselves. And That's one kind of test. I use something a lot called Inside, and so it's a very similar looking at carbs and fat in a different way, but more at the top end.
Okay.
And then I also use a variety of softwares. Generally, people who I coach privately, I use WKO4 and I use software called Exert.
Okay.
And I use them both for different reasons. But looking at potential, I would say using a test from Inside or Exert with proper signature from good data would be where I would start, because if I have a lot of good data from a person in Exert, or I can do an Inside test on someone, I can really tell when they walk in the door, have they been doing a lot of like short intervals or high intensity training, or have they been doing a lot of base training and have a good tempo ability? So in a pretty quick window, their strengths will come out of the test. So therefore they could be directed towards a certain sport. As far as like watts per kilo to become a cyclocross racer, or I've never really tracked that information, to be totally honest, because
Okay, yeah.
I just always tried to help. I never tried to change anybody's mind, so I might be the wrong person to
Okay,
answer
no, that makes
question.
total sense. I think that's good because the athlete has to be aligned with their goals, right? Or what they want to do. And if you're trying to push them in a direction, it's never going to work.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we're talking about like at the elite level, things don't trickle down as far as we think they do, which is why I really have a problem with regular people trying to train the same way as elite riders on a scaled down fashion.
Okay.
Because, I've had people, come second in mountain bike national championships, which is midsummer, and then just go back to, base training and then just say, hey, I'd like to race cyclocross season just to keep my mind sharp so I don't get bored of, living in Ontario and skiing and snowshoeing and riding my trainer. So they do cyclocross and they'll generally not do the whole season, but I've had people win national cyclocross championships when they're not even training for it.
Okay. Okay.
So, I mean, in the past, in Canada anyway, there's been a number of mountain bikers, some I coach, some I don't, have been very successful, like filling the top batch of cyclocross nationals.
Okay.
Which maybe says something about how cyclocross people are trying to get fast for nationals, but that's maybe another podcast.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. So when you look at a generic plan, you see a lot of them are power based, right? And it says everyone should do these intervals, and that's kind of the goal. Do you think that certain people respond better to low intensity training and others need more high intensity training? Are different athletes different?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, you can. Yes. So once you define whether a person is successful on the lower or higher kind of training, at the end of the day, you have to remember that let's pretend you've got two people who want to race a mountain bike for 90 minutes.
Yep.
One's really good and gets very good off of lower intensity training, and the other one gets better off of high intensity training. Both training plans can't be exactly the same, because if you flip them over, the athletes will either not get better or they'll overtrain on the other person's plan.
Okay.
There has to be a little bit of a mixture in each other's plan that looks similar, but the majority of it might be different. And that's going to come from people that are smarter than me when you look at muscle fiber types and biopsies and all that stuff. But you can usually see that as a coach when a person can or can't complete a certain kind of a workout.
Okay.
Right, you give one person 6 by 45 seconds and 4:15 off, and you tell them to go as hard as they can.
Yep.
The person with the really good high intensity genetics actually might not finish the workout. They are able to go so hard.
Oh.
Right, they might get to the fourth or fifth interval, because if I ask someone to go as hard as they can, maybe they can only finish 4 or 5 intervals because they're cooked.
Interesting.
Whereas the low intensity person, he or she will probably do an amazing job at pacing those intervals really hard, in their anaerobic capacity zone, but they'll all be equal and they'll be the same. They'll be equal and they'll be hard. And so depending on how you listen to the instructions, I want you to go as hard as you possibly can, right? And if we start talking about that kind of anaerobic capacity training, well, pacing isn't one of the instructions usually when done properly. So anyways, I won't go on too much, but that's one big difference is just try giving different athletes a different workout, and quickly you'll see that one has a very good anaerobic capacity and the other one does not.
Okay. Interesting. All right, let's get into some general coaching stuff. So there's two popular training models that I want to talk about because a lot of people are familiar with these training models, and then I want to talk about your system a little bit. So the first one is the threshold model that was made popular by Coggin, and that's where you spend a lot of time training around your threshold. And the second is the polarized model where you do a blood lactate test. You have your LT1 and your LT2. For anyone listening to this who has no idea what I'm talking about, we did a podcast on this with Dr. Seiler from Norway, so you should check that out. But basically, the polarized model says that you spend about 90% of your time below the first breakpoint LT1 and 10% of your time above LT2. So knowing that, let's start with the threshold model. And what are your thoughts on the threshold model, and how do you feel it falls short in any way if it does?
I think I guess my biggest issue with the threshold model is kind of what I alluded to earlier, which was your threshold is constantly changing, especially through training load.
Okay.
So when, if you test your FTP and then you base all your threshold intervals off of 95 or 90% of that FTP, and you're very strict and you do all your stuff, your 2x20s and 3x15s and 4x10s, then over the course of a 3-week period, your actual threshold is falling due to fatigue and amongst other factors.
Correct.
And then you're theoretically now possibly training at 2 or 3% above your threshold. And what I see is that it generally works for the first, and I'll have to be a bit vague, but 1 to 3 years for a client when they're focused on FTP training.
Okay.
But after that, they either get really tired and get nervous and look for help, or they actually don't look for help and they overtrain and then they look for help.
Okay.
Because anyway, so that's my biggest thing, I guess, is that the threshold is changing on a regular basis, and it's probably changing on a percentage, a big enough percentage over a short period of time that the workouts become very challenging.
Okay, so if a lot of athletes will do like a three build and then a recovery week on the fourth week. So you're saying as you build up to that fourth week, you're getting enough fatigue that your FTP changes.
I think so, but I mean, I think it's life. Like if we were in person, I would take a whiteboard and I would say, hey, do you have children? Put kids up on the board. Hey, do you have a job? Put a job up on the board, and so on. And I'd make a list and I'd add up all these things and I'd draw a picture of a bicycle. And then that long line of things equals your gas tank.
Okay.
So it's not just the training that takes gas out of our gas tank, and and looking at FTP changing over time, because in a perfect world, over a 3-week period with properly fueled people and maybe getting a massage and stretching for an hour a day and getting to lie around on the couch, and I think that maybe that's probably different, but that's not usually who we're dealing with.
Okay, that makes a ton of sense. Okay, so if we talk about the polarized model, what are your thoughts on that, and do you feel that system falls short in any way? Because that's mainly based on heart rates.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the closest to what I do, I would say. I think that one thing you did say was you said it was based on 90-10, which is, I think, really actually just coming out now. Because really it's mostly been based off of 80 and 20%, right?
Yeah, it is. And so when we talked with Dr. Seiler, he said there's a lot of confusion around that point. And what he said was that 80% of the sessions were below LT1 and 20% of the sessions were above LT2, and the total time. So that's just the number of training sessions. But if you look at the time distribution, it's 90-10.
Yeah, and I so that I agree with, but I think what happens is that the misconception of 80-20 is what happens, right? So
correct.
So anyways, we won't go on about that, but I agree. The 90-10 is a lot closer to what I find. I'd say that, to be honest, if I take a master's athlete with a full-time job and 3 kids, and that person goes in a stage race and they happen to have just won a few weeks ago, a fairly big stage race on a mountain bike,
Yep.
their training's not based on power. It's 95-5 is the highest split I ever see.
Okay.
So based on power, let's round to 90-10. But over years, I mean 8 years of data, with a number of athletes that are 50 to 58 years old that generally stand on the podium at fairly big stage races in mountain biking. They are never over 90-10 on a weekly basis, and generally it's around 96-4 or 95-5.
Wow. For the whole season, that's their kind of distribution.
Yeah. I mean, I actually pulled up a tab so I could just kind of tear through it if you want. And so if I just
do that.
If I just pick one of these, I don't even need to, like 95-5, 96-4, 99-1, 98-2, 95-5. Those are just weeks and weeks in March, and the race was early April. So that's whatever, 4 weeks in front of a 5-day stage race, and that was their polarity ratio.
Wow. So they're doing a ton of aerobic work, and you're getting the high intensity stuff when you need it, but consistent or very concise intervals.
Yeah. And
Nice.
intervals and or racing. So because I don't do a lot of threshold training, I will use races to get people ready to race, because it's not just physiological. There's bike handling. There's the mental. Sometimes you have to learn to pace yourself. So if someone's going to tear off down the trail, then you need to know yourself, and that comes from training and racing to be confident in your pacing ability. So
Yep.
you need to have people around you to practice that. So there's a variety of things that you need to practice before you go to race. And there's generally a good amount of threshold training in a race.
Nice. Yeah, that makes total sense. Okay, so when we talked last time before this interview, you told me that you based a lot of your coaching methodologies on Brad Hudson's book, Run Faster. So I read the entire book, and Brad refers to his coaching as an adaptive style of coaching. Can you describe what adaptive coaching is, and is it similar or different to either of the models we've talked about, the threshold model and the polarized model?
So just quickly on the book. So I actually don't base my philosophy is just very similar. So whenever people ask me about philosophies,
Yep.
I always refer to that book because it was the first book I ever read that sounded like me.
Okay.
And I've never written a book, so I can say, hey, if I wrote a book, it'd be like Brad's.
Okay.
So
great.
so anyways, I just really, because I haven't written a book, so it's a very good book in that it seems general, and adaptive to me is kind of what I'm talking about. This whole, our life changes, which affects our gas tank, and so trying to figure out the right amount of squeeze out of your gas tank each day to make sure you move your training forward.
Yep.
And what I generally have success training people a lot easier, and therefore I can get a lot more training stress in over time. They don't get injured. They don't get sick. Other than it being a bit boring when you live in Canada and have to train indoors, sometimes, like this winter was bad. So we have had the guy who won the stage race didn't ride outside until he showed up on day one of the stage race.
Wow.
And even the guy he beat lived 40 minutes away from where the race was. He was like, what do you guys do? So, it's the biggest part about the adaptive portion for me is I kind of want to build a plan that doesn't require too much adapting. So
Okay.
I think if it's too much on the edge, like it's kind of you're once again using an FTP, or I do actually a lot of training based on like maximal aerobic power.
Okay.
But if I'm going to do a VO2 max workout and I have an MAP from 3 weeks ago, that's where things get adaptive because there's not that much of that training in my program.
Okay.
But if all workouts were based on power and you kind of always have someone living on the edge in every workout, then that would require a lot of adaptation, because then the athlete would have to say, wow, my respiration was really high, my muscles were really sore. They'd have this list of negatives
Yep.
then you'd have to adapt.
Okay.
I guess I like his philosophy because of the aerobic component to it.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about maximum aerobic power? That's something I haven't really heard much on this show. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and how you use it for training?
Sure. So there's a couple of different ways that I think most people would agree on finding it. You can either do a step test that is 3 minutes per step. You're roughly looking for an 8 to 10 beat linear heart rate line per step. That's how you know you have the right wattage for the fitness and the weight of the athlete. But it's usually 15 to 20 watts per 3 minutes for females and men under 150 pounds.
Okay.
And then 25 to 30 watts a step for the rest of the crowd, people over, sort of elite women and men over 150 pounds. So you just do that to failure, and then you would get out of that test a max indoor heart, because the test would be done on a trainer. So you'd have a max indoor heart rate, and you would have a peak 1 minute power that they achieve. So they don't have to finish an entire stage. You just take the peak 1 minute power.
Okay.
And then that would be, deemed maximum power or a proxy for, VO2 max power.
Okay.
So you can then confirm that by taking another day. This is just mean, but you could then do this another day, and you would have the athlete warm up, and then you would have them hold their maximal aerobic power as long as they can.
Oh.
And that's where we could get into this whole discussion about mental capacity, because that part I've seen, an awesome thing about using Exert software is you can see when someone quits too early. Anyway,
Okay.
So the mental aspect of that time trial becomes very difficult, but then also might show you something that you might have to work on your athlete with so that they can have some more success with their fitness outside.
Okay.
So the other way to find it would be 10 watts a minute. You don't get much of a different result, but the athletes do tend to find that it's easier to perform, and the results are close enough for the training. The 3 minute test does provide a bit of an insight to their aerobic system, because especially if you're watching them do it, or you're lucky enough to watch it, you can see when they start to fidget. And so the earlier someone starts to fidget on their way to their maximum aerobic power, the weaker their aerobic system.
Okay.
It just means that if their aerobic system is better, their tempo and their threshold abilities are higher, so therefore they're a lot more comfortable on their way to their MAP.
Yep.
But that also, so once again, that shows you that they have a good, strong aerobic system, where the person who's fidgety early but can suffer into the test, they have probably a pretty good anaerobic capacity.
Nice. Okay. Interesting. So go ahead, keep going.
I was just going to say, so then I would base I usually base interval workouts or training sessions off a power that is relative to a test. So tricky for everybody, but I would, if I'm going to do VO2 max work or anaerobic capacity work, then I would base it off of maximum aerobic power, because it's kind of like looking at, if a person has a strong aerobic capacity, then they're going to be able to do VO2 max intervals at a higher wattage relative to threshold than a person who doesn't. So
Okay.
if I base VO2 max intervals off of 130% of threshold, that might be very easy for one person and very hard for the other. Make sense?
Yeah. Why is that? Because I find personally the high VO2 stuff is almost impossible for me to do. So, and I know other guys who can do it all day long. So is that something to do with the maximum aerobic test that you're talking about?
No, that's more like comparing your tempo ability to your anaerobic capacity or your VO2 max. So if you have, it depends. If we talk specifically about you, if you had to do 10 30/30s or 10 times 1 minute at VO2 max, would you be able to complete the session but only at 15% above, or would you not be able to complete the session?
I would complete it, but I was the guy who would probably pace it perfectly and do
Right.
it,
Yes, I mean, based on that, you probably have either you haven't developed your anaerobic capacity, which is a possibility because a lot of people ignore it.
Yep.
And even though that's above VO2 max, I don't want to go too. So you probably are very well suited to the things that you're interested in, right? Long mountain bike races and lots of time in the saddle. So
Yep.
you could some people would argue that you don't need that training to be successful at your sport. And it's possibly true, especially if you're going to go in something long and pace yourself and not worry about anybody else, and you know there's not going to be attack and all that stuff. But if you're going to be in the mix and competitive with a few other people, then you might need a little bit of an anaerobic capacity to draw on, so you could surge through a really hard technical section and try to make a gap. But generally over really long endurance races, those things get brought back.
Exactly. Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about, we talked about the aerobic development that is important. In Hudson's book, I'm going to reference his book again, but he talks about neuromuscular strength that runners, in his case, need as a foundation of fitness to build, race-specific fitness off of. And he uses hill sprints that last 8 to 10 seconds. So do you do that with cyclists? And if so, what type of workouts or is like an interval would you give a cyclist to build neuromuscular strength?
So if they're not doing strength training, then I would use I would start at I start at 15 seconds and I actually work them down towards 8.
Okay.
Generally, this is like I have to step outside of the box a bit. I've trained a lot of hockey players and a lot of lacrosse players at a pretty high level.
Oh wow. Okay.
Like NCAA Division I and NHL. So that when you start dealing with teenagers that still have parents that are involved, they always want a quicker first step for their child. Okay. So that's the first question asked when you train a sport athlete. But what happens is generally sports that the people have been allowed to do too much long distance sprinting. So in hockey, they go blue line to blue line or back and forth. And that's really like 15 to 25 seconds.
Okay.
And then they're not given enough recovery. So they're asked to do it again. So it's not sprinting anymore. It's like tempo sprinting.
Right.
So if you want to develop neuromuscular power, then you have to allow a lot of time for recovery. And the athlete actually has to be able to go hard. Now, when you start with a person, they won't know how to go hard yet.
Okay.
It might take them 5 seconds to wind up, and then they can go hard. Now, eventually, you want to be able to have the athlete go hard right away. Like if I ask you to jump on a box, right?
Yep.
You have to jump on the 30-inch box. You don't get to like run towards the box and then jump on a 10-inch box and then jump on the 30-inch box. That doesn't count.
Right.
So you either, skin your shins or you jump on the box.
Okay.
So whereas in cycling we have all these gears and all this stuff. So, I've done things in the past where I like put a big rubber band around a person's seat post and I'm their sled and they have to drag me on their bike right away.
Okay.
So now all of a sudden they have load right away that they have to overcome.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
So a lot of people don't know how to generate load quickly. So they can't, so if you give them 15 or 10 or 8-second sprints, like Brad would do, that's awesome. But he's doing it up a hill with his runners. So they have no choice except for to generate some work.
Yep.
But I find that even cyclists uphill, and you can see it if you get all into all the details and you look at the torque in their file after the workout, they actually don't generate much torque right away. It comes into the interval.
Okay.
So there's a coaching process to doing neuromuscular training properly.
Interesting. And strength work.
Or else it's just a waste of time.
No, you're right. You're right. So you're saying that strength work can achieve that, so you can do it off the bike as well if you're doing strength work.
Yeah, you can. Absolutely, but it takes. I'm a big believer in strength training. Takes a lot of practice to develop the skills to be able to do something and like develop neuromuscular power.
Okay.
You have to know how to jump and land before you can on the floor before you can do box jumps that are high enough to develop neuromuscular power, or you have to have a certain amount of skills before you can start doing power cleans.
Yep.
Right. All these things take a lot of time to develop. So probably teaching a cyclist how to do it properly in sprint training by starting at a low speed, picking the right gear, trying to get them to bust their cranks off their bike in the first 8 seconds instead of 12 to 15.
Yep.
So I don't know if that helps, but
No, that makes a ton of sense. I've been working with a physical therapist here in San Diego. I've been injured for a lot of years, on and off, and it was the first guy who actually sat down with me and said, "You need to learn how to move first."
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I've spent so much time with this guy doing the most minute, small exercises before he even lets me touch weight. And a lot of therapists will kind of say that, but then they just throw a bunch of stuff at you and it never works. But I have spent a lot of time just doing these really refined movements, and they are so particular. If my hip is, a couple degrees out, they're like, no, start over. And it's taken a long time, but I've noticed a big change in just how my body feels. Even on the bike, I noticed my posterior chain like working much better than it ever has. I'm doing these long rides and I'm like, my hamstrings are tired, and that's never happened before. So it's interesting how that works if you train yourself to do it the right way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And what you said was perfect. Most people talk about things, but they actually don't really require it of you.
Yes.
Most therapists don't have the confidence to keep someone in front of them doing something boring. And this is a big North American problem, right? In Europe, people they grew up, learning how to do a shoulder roll and all these different gymnastics movements, and they develop a lot of things we never even get exposed to.
Exactly. And I really appreciate it when I talked to this guy. I said, how long is this going to take? And the typical answer you hear from a PT is, I'll have you pain free in 3 sessions, and 4 weeks later, you'll be good. And he looked at me and he said, it's going to take 3 to 6 months for you to correct your movement patterns. And I thought,
Yep.
that's a really honest answer, right?
Absolutely.
And I just have to do the work. So I like that. As far as pacing goes, I want to ask you more about pacing for races later. But when you talk about pacing for your workouts, what kind of zones do you use? Because Brad in the book uses like 3K pace, 5K pace, half marathon pace. What do you give cyclists?
So I'm lucky enough to be able to test them. So I would use a metabolic cart, and or the inside test, depending on where the person is, to define endurance pace.
Okay.
Same thing for tempo pace. And then I would use my MAP, or maximum aerobic power, for VO2 max workouts.
Okay.
Now, in the beginning, so those are so I have an endurance test decision, mostly arguably based on carbs and fat, so how your body does its work. The endurance pace is generally a lot lower than people think or want it to be.
Yeah.
And I mean, so quick numbers, I take a person who comes to our gym on 5 to 8 hours a week and because we have a shocking number, we have several people with maximum aerobic powers over 400 watts.
Ooh.
So they've been coming to our gym for 4 to 5. We've been open for 5 years, so they've been very consistent. And I'll be honest, I never thought I'd say we have these people who had 280 watt MAPs, 4 years ago, are now above 400 watts, because that's people racing elite or winning masters. Like, these are solid numbers.
Right.
So now take that same person and test their aerobic system. They might have a max fat of 165 watts. And then take that same person that I coach privately. They have a slightly lower maximum aerobic power, but they have a fat max of 280 watts.
Wow.
So the picture, or the makeup of the MAP, is really what brings success outside. And so I'll stop talking about numbers, but you can have drastically different aerobic numbers that can, part way back in the notes for, what we're going to talk about is how to get a small improvement. And I'd say that the best way to a small improvement is to work on your aerobic system properly.
Interesting.
So I've been talking so long now, I forget what you asked me.
No, I was just asking about pacing.
Zones.
Yeah, zones.
I'm coming around. So generally speaking, VO2 max and higher, when I start working with someone, I would give them a 100% MAP workout. And so a VO2 max workout, very strict power numbers, with a heart rate range of 90 to 95%.
Of max.
Yes.
Okay.
That's where the workout becomes adaptive. So they'll start out with power, and let's say they had to do 21 90-second intervals with 3 minutes off. So
Okay.
they'd start this workout, their heart rate wouldn't respond till maybe interval 10 or 11. If it is responding nicely, then that means they're ready for that workout. They continue, but if they start to get above 95%, which is likely when they begin, now they have to shave power off, and they finish the workout by power.
Okay.
And what happens over time is the athlete then does all the intervals at 100% MAP in the 90 to 94% range. Then I'm patient, and we keep doing it until they get down to about 90%, and then we bump it up a bit, usually from testing.
Okay.
But the power-based world would, and I know some people that use the same intervals. They're all over the internet by a guy named Guy Thibault, who's a Canadian physiologist who was with the national team for a long, long time. He's done a lot of work with Veronique Bilat, who's a running coach.
Okay.
And she's the person, in my opinion, who's really responsible for all the work on 30-30s.
Okay.
So I know lots of coaches who use those workouts, but only by power. And I generally see them overtrain their athletes fairly quickly.
Okay.
So I started to incorporate heart rate, and I had a lot of success with the same stuff. And it just requires patience to allow the athlete to adapt to the workout physically and mentally. And then, because if you have to shave off 5% of your VO2 max power to finish 7 intervals, it's still an amazing training session.
Yeah.
And if you look at cross country skiing and whatnot, then they don't have a power meter, so they would do a lot of their VO2 max training between 90 and 95% heart rate.
Yeah.
So a friend of mine was a national champion cross country skier for 4 years, and he's actually the person who took me for my very first run, and I died. But I got to watch a real person who had dyslexia, finish top 10 at the Olympics. So he just did what his coach told him.
Okay.
So it's very interesting to watch someone over 8 to 10 years become who he became and see what he did for training.
Yeah.
So a lot of my coaching background actually comes from watching him train and then listening to my mentor. So
interesting. Okay, so that's the high end of it. Now you keep referencing a metabolic cart, and you're getting so with the polarized system, if you do a blood lactate profile, you kind of have that first break point, LT1. Is that what you're determining with the metabolic cart?
I do both at the same time. So I use lactate during the step test at the same time as the metabolic cart.
Okay.
And so you'll hear a lot of reference back and forth with LT1 and VT1.
Yes.
LT2 and VT2, and they can be slightly different on different people, but they're so close that when you get out into the training world, they're the same.
Okay.
But you could really, in my opinion, intersperse those.
Okay.
So the metabolic cart for me is great to show people that they have a lot of fat in the mixture, because people understand they want to utilize fat as fuel when they're training their endurance system.
Right.
But when they can see it happening, because what happens is you can see it live on the screen. You start easy and you should be burning more fats than carbs. That's 80% of the time not the case, but you're definitely burning more fat, at least at a certain point of time. And so then people start to understand, well, holy yeah, if I always train at 200 watts and I'm almost out of fat and I'm nearly running on completely carbs, it starts to make sense to them why they need to slow down when they do their training. Oh. Right? Which is what Steven says all the time. People just don't have he has a great word for following training prescription zones. It always slips my mind, but people like elite athletes follow prescription of training easy properly. And most masters athletes just train too hard all the time. They just can't follow the rules and go easy enough.
Interesting. I love training easy. It's my favorite thing to do.
I know, but
I could go out all day. I'm rare.
Most
I
people
get
don't.
it. I'm a rare duck, but I'm the guy who loves to say, "Oh, I found out that my LT one was lower than I thought it was. It was I had it tested at 129 or whatever, and I'm just so happy to go easy for 5 hours."
Right, and now that's heart rate, right?
Heart rate, yeah.
Yeah. So, but see, like, so forever, without all, because I don't get to test everybody, but I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've always had a metabolic cart and a lactate analyzer.
Yep.
So I've never had, I don't even know how many tests I've done. It's in the thousands, and it's not just elite people, it's on elite people, beginners, everybody.
Yeah.
So I started to look, what I did a long time ago, 15 years ago, is I took everyone's training zones, right? All these training zones from all these different people, I put them on a spreadsheet. First of all, when you actually put them all on a spreadsheet, they're so close to each other, it's not funny.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. Probably within 5%. So if you're 129 or 126 or 133, that's probably close enough for most people.
Okay. And you're saying most people are about there?
Well, yeah. So where I was headed was usually it's 60 to 70% of max heart rate.
Okay. My max was I had it tested at 198. So yeah, that would be 60 to 70%. Yeah, that's exactly where it is. So you're right.
I was just getting my calculator. So what was your max?
198
times 0.7. Yeah, so technically it's 138.6 would be the top.
Okay.
And if I take 0.6, it'd be 118.
118.
So like I said, it's off at the top by 6 beats, 6.5 beats.
Yep.
But that's a lot closer because remember, most people train at 75%.
Yeah.
And then they actually then they'll train by power, and if you do a 3-hour ride, they're actually upwards of 85%.
Yep.
And then people say, "Oh, don't worry about it. That's just cardiac drift." But that's actually not cardiac drift. That's your respiration system. And if you want to get into that another time, that's fine. But basically, so my endurance zone without any testing, I'd safely say is 60 to 70%. People are going to have to walk up hills at that range, and they're not going to like it. And then that's where coaching comes in to get them to understand what's happening physiologically. Like, don't go on a hilly trail and try to do an endurance ride.
Okay. No, I love what you're saying because this is my thing. I let so many people pass me and I go on training rides with people and they're like, "You're going too slow." I'm like, just trust me, it works. And it's worked so well for me in the last, I've done it for about a year and I'm up 50 to 60 watts from where I started.
Awesome. So, patience, right?
Patience, man. Patience.
Yeah.
Okay. So real quick, since we're on this topic, do you prescribe any training time between, in that gray zone that the polarized system talks about between LT1 or VT1 and LT2 or VT2?
Yeah, I mean, technically, a fair bit.
A fair
bit. And I pulled up a little bit of information here, and hopefully we can just do quick math.
Yep.
And I might be wrong. I think I only heard this once on one of Steven's podcasts, but it's one of those things that maybe a lot of people didn't hear. So right at the end of a podcast once, he started talking about someone who is studying what he called the Pyramidal Model.
Yep.
So have you heard of this?
I haven't actually.
Okay. So ever since I've had Lyme disease, I need to write everything down. And so I apologize.
No, it's okay.
For me repeating myself and forgetting words, it's actually been tricky over the last few years. I'm not going to lie.
You're doing great. This is a very interesting podcast, so keep going.
But what he was referring to is Steven's been studying one thing, and I believe extremely well. And I actually know some of the people that are in his world, like top cross-country skiers that have been, 8th at the Olympics who weren't doping. So
okay.
I've seen these people train over 10 years. I know exactly what they've done. I've seen it. I lived with 3 national team cross-country skiers for 7 years. Okay. So, but in the podcast, right at the end, he referred to someone new who is studying. They're breaking down the information a little bit further, and they're finding that there's a lot more stuff above LT1 than they originally thought.
Okay.
And so I'd refer that as tempo or sweet spot, because technically both of those two things are nearly the same.
Okay.
So if I just use some random numbers here of an athlete that I coach who is the person that just won the stage race. So here's a 51-year-old person, 3 kids, CEO of a pretty cool, a really cool non-for-profit company, but I won't go any further than that.
Understood.
But he's busy, right?
Yeah.
A lot of history, been a cyclist for a long time, but his breakdown of his training now, 99% of it indoors before an outdoor race. So February would have been, let's go, it would have been 10%, 16, 17% of his training power wise was at threshold or above. So it's going to
Okay.
look like 80-20, right?
Yeah.
But there's 27% of that is tempo.
Okay. And
So
I'm guessing that's because he's doing stage racing. Like you have to get to race specificity at some point, right?
he just actually was 5. So he just raced our local like Ontario Cup mountain bike race,
Yeah.
which was 90 minutes.
Okay.
He hasn't done any, so let me just go through his 3 months and I'll give you that result
yeah.
too. So then there's less. So March there's more tempo. So there's now 30, 65, 70, 85% tempo and below, 5% threshold, and the rest is above.
Okay.
And then the next month again, even more. So now we're down to less than 7%. So the closer we get to the race, the more and more tempo he does and the less intensity. And it was, 3 hours a day, 5 days long, right?
Yep.
But he just raced for 90 minutes on Sunday, and he was 5 seconds off the win and 3.5 minutes ahead of third. And our province is very competitive in his category over 90 minutes.
I'd imagine. Yeah.
So he just, I don't know, he's 2 weeks off the stage race. Last week he did a road race, which was 2 hours and 15 minutes, and he came second in that too.
Amazing.
So I don't know. I don't believe that you have to do more specific intensity other than race if you plan your race schedule properly.
Okay. Interesting. All right, let's talk a little bit about reaching your potential. So for athletes who've been at this for, I don't know, a couple years, or maybe they had they raced for 8 years or 10 years before, they took 5 years off, and now they're getting back into it. How many years do you think it takes an athlete to reach their potential? And you can give me a range. That's fine.
A lot quicker than a new person. So the person we're talking about right now, actually, I don't know. I'd say a year to 2.
Okay.
But very fairly quickly, because most people that were doing things a long time ago did a lot of endurance.
Yep.
So this last 5 to 6 years, there's been way more focus on high intensity training, right?
Yep.
So if you have someone who has a lot of history, and especially if they are in the triathlon world or road world, they probably did a lot of endurance and racing, because intervals weren't super popular for regular people until 5 to 7, really the last 5 to 7 years. If you were in a club and you were just riding with people, there'd be hard sections and a lot of natural intervals, but mostly endurance. And I see this especially from people who've a background in triathlon and switched to cycling or mountain biking.
Yep.
They don't mind. They have a lot of endurance in their background.
Yep.
So I find that they can generally get into shape fairly quickly because they have a big base.
Okay.
Whereas if you take a person who played hockey a lot, say maybe a lot of junior and maybe even a little bit of semi-pro, then they got a job and now they're 42 and all their friends are cycling and they don't want to golf.
Right.
Though the background of that person, now we're talking 4 to 5 years to reach their potential.
Okay.
They'll be amazing at first, and they'll have lots of grit and tenacity and high end power. So if they go in a weekly night mountain bike race, it's 45 minutes, they'll look like a machine.
Right.
But if you give them something, 2 hours long, or they want to go do a stage race, or they want to do a 50 miler, they're just going to crumple.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it takes a lot of time for them to get that kind of fitness, a lot longer than it does to add a little bit of intensity to a person with a big base.
Interesting. Okay, very good point. All right, so we frame this as the guy who trains 4 to 8 hours. Now, if you said in an ideal world, you got to buck up and find, some more time or whatever, what is the optimal amount of hours? And you can use TSS if you want, training stress score, because that's maybe a better way of measuring intensity. But what type of weekly dose do you think a cyclist needs to reach their potential?
I think so. To be able to start changing numbers and move forward, like move the needle forward.
Yeah.
I think you probably need 10 to 12.
10 to 12. Okay. And as far as TSS goes, do you have any idea what type of TSS your athletes need to get there?
I didn't pull that chart up, but I can. Give me 2 seconds.
Awesome.
Take long.
You're a WKO guy, so I know you got some TSS numbers there.
Well, to be honest, for this, I actually use Exert more often.
Exert. Okay.
Yep. So if we look at CTL, let's say.
Okay. Is that critical training load? Is that what that stands for?
Yeah. So like chronic training load.
Chronic training load. Okay.
So if we talk and then if we just call training load and exert, so the same thing.
Okay.
It's really getting to a chronic training load where I see the biggest difference. So this is going to take me 10 seconds to pull this up. If you
go nuts. I'm an engineer, man. The numbers are getting me very excited. And a lot of listeners love that on the show too. So take your time. So
because I might as well give you real stuff than guessing. Mm-hmm. So if I go into, and we'll keep talking about the same person. Okay. Here's a few things I like to look for. CTL, I'd say masters athletes start to get really fast around 90 plus.
Okay.
So that's chronic training load. Now, keeping in mind that you can have a 90 CTL and be out of shape because all the training that brought you there was wrong.
Okay.
So there's a lot of assumptions that everything's awesome. The person continues to get better. But to get away from numbers for a moment, when you look at, say, WKO4 or you look at Exert and you look at the chronic training load, acute training load kind of graph, which is the rolling accumulation of TSS.
Yep.
I really like to see the angle of that at around 45 degrees while you're building a person's fitness.
Okay.
And you can go into details and talk about how many that is per day and this, that, and the other thing. But most people won't know how to build a rolling ramp rate of 3.8 TSS points per week. But if they're doing, but put it this way, if they're following a training plan, which we've referred to a bit, and then they go look at their TSS and the line is flat, there's a problem. Okay, because they're not building any TSS.
Right.
So they might be building some fitness, but if they don't have some training load to support that fitness over time, they will plateau, which is what you referred to.
That's a really interesting point.
So I like to see the picture of training load, at least building, and I found the ideal, because when you put a ramp rate in a spreadsheet and you look at it, it creates a 45-degree line.
Okay.
But even if someone was building between 30 and 45 degrees, right?
It's better than flat.
They're building.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing. So it's maybe a bit general, but it's very important, because if I take an athlete, I'm going to pick someone different. He's older. He has less time. And he's about what you're talking about. He's a 4 or 5 year cyclist versus a 20-year cyclist.
Okay.
This will only take a second. So this person is okay. So if we take an entire season, when I met the person, I've only been coaching them for 6 months. First thing I do is I kind of go look at their old training in a general view to see if there's any holes.
Yep.
First thing I noticed was, from May 2018 all the way through the end of the season, the training load was like it never went up or down. It was nearly flat all summer.
Okay.
And winter. So there's definitely no 45-degree build there, right?
Right.
So as an example, if we go year to date, that's like a training load of 67 points. And their threshold was 246 at the time.
Okay.
And I'm randomly picking off of so this is like you were sitting here watching me do this live.
Yep.
And if I go look at that now, the person has a threshold of 240 watts with a training load of 92. So a lot of people would say, well, their threshold's down 6 watts. And I'm like, yeah, their threshold's down 6 watts with 35% more training load in their legs.
Yeah, no kidding.
So if I get this 58-year-old person to 130, because I have other people that I've been working with for 68 years, if I build this person to 130 points by July, and then I start pulling that away, his threshold is going to be 270, and he's going to be a very fast, happy person.
Exactly.
So people, especially people are so software based, they have, and I won't repeat myself, but I think this is important. They assume the software is telling them everything about their fitness.
Okay.
Doesn't matter which software you use, you have to understand the software can only show you what you've shown it.
Okay.
So if I do a lot of functional threshold power training, then my threshold in the software will appear to be higher, right?
Right.
Because I've dosed the software a lot with threshold work. But if I do a lot of 60 to 70% below LT1 work, the software can't read that as an improvement in threshold or VO2 max. But all coaches know that if you do a lot of this training and some of this training, then you can improve a person's threshold. You could do 3 months of training and be improving threshold the whole time. Software might not be able to pick that up, but testing would.
Interesting.
Does that make sense?
That makes total sense.
Okay,
so you're saying that WKOs, the today's plans, they don't always see it because you haven't given it the right information.
Yeah, and I got to remember, I don't want it to sound negative, but if you don't dose it with some of the right training, then it can't. So
yeah, that makes sense.
And I use them all. I actually use today's plan with some athletes. I use Training Peaks with some athletes because they like the platform, whatever. And I use Exert a lot for looking at things in the background and planning workouts and looking at races. So I've been using Exert for 2 years. So
I got to look this up. You keep referencing it, and I feel another podcast coming on with the guys at Exert or something.
Yeah, you should reach out to Armando. I mean, the guy's from Toronto, and it's funny because I don't like to pick sides. I do use all the tools because I believe all the tools have a strength and a weakness, like an iPhone and a Samsung.
Yep.
So that's how I look at software, and I'm not tied to any one of them, and I do use them all for different reasons. But if we're trying to help people, if they want to understand their own training and they're following an FTP-based training program or a high-intensity training program, one of the things that they will see in all the softwares is they will not be able to build training stress.
Okay.
And so if you can't build training load, then you can't build lasting fitness. So I'm not saying you can't do a threshold training plan and get ready for a race in April, right?
Right.
And then not do really, just do summer things and be with the family, and then pick another race in the fall and train for 6 or 8 weeks and tear off a really awesome race. But that's different than someone trying to compete all summer. Even at a recreational level, it's very different going in 8 to 12 events, whether they're races or just charity rides. Like, you actually have to train, and you need training load to be able to move forward.
Okay. I love it. That's really good. Let me ask you this, and then we're going to get to, we have 2 questions after that, after this one. So how do we know when we've reached our potential? So you could have the guy out there who's like, well, I got to this and I have 5% more. How do we know?
I think you need to get to know the person more, because the mental capacity of performance, it can be huge. So, because I did so much, before people started talking about, the 40% rule that they look at in the military and whatnot, and mental capacity. And I remember when I had, I guess the best year ever was 7 of the top 11 pro men in Canadian mountain biking at nationals.
Okay.
And so I had a lot of testing on these people and power meters on all of them. And so like, years, 5 to 8 years of data on 7 athletes. And there's actually 3 women in the top 5. So there's a pretty crazy build up to those results. And I would have certain athletes with the same testing numbers, the same technical skills in the grand scheme of things.
Okay.
But in a real race, one person would always be 3 to 4 minutes ahead of the other, which is far outside the percentage of their testing and their skills.
Okay.
So that's just like the ability to suffer, to be able to live on the edge of suffering and not fall over it. Whereas, some people start to suffer and they're like, okay, this is pretty good, but there might be 4% more in them that just hurts a little bit more and won't affect their pacing, but it's just going to feel awful.
Yep. It's funny you say that because I remember Simon Whitfield said something about Alistair Brownlee. I don't know if you saw that race where he just collapsed at the finish line. He just fell over. And I think Simon said, that scares me because I can't do that. You know what I mean? And that's a level that some people can get to that others just can't.
Yeah, like Bjorn Dolly was one of them in cross-country skiing, right?
Right.
And everyone thought it was like just part of his MO, but I think he could empty his tank at the right time, all the time.
Exactly.
So I think mental. So I'll refer back to it again. The neat thing about Exert, when you have what's called an accurate signature, is I can actually tell where a person's MAP test should end.
Interesting.
So I can take 2 athletes in my gym, right?
Yep.
And I don't ever let them sit beside each other because so picture you got 2 athletes that are very competitive, MAPs within 5 to 10 watts.
Yep.
They both race in the same category. They both have very similar experience. When I place them side by side, athlete B will always pedal as long as athlete A. If I separate them in class so that athlete B can't see athlete A, athlete B always quits 3 minutes before the other one. So, it refers to like external and internal motivation. So I understand that in real racing, you have external motivation. But I do think that eventually, if you're that person who's going to quit on your own, it's going to show up in a race somewhere.
Interesting.
So the mental side of things is tricky, and teaching someone how to suffer can be done. Now, it doesn't mean, sure, I've seen crazy things happen in my career. I'm, generally a little nicer and don't yell at people, but you do have to present them with the proper workouts that will stretch their abilities over time so that they eventually think, oh, that you can't just walk up and like hit them with a hammer. You kind of you have to tap them. You have to tap them with like a sponge mallet first, and then move up to tap them with a rubber mallet, and then when you start hitting them with the hammer, they're like, wow, that's not so bad.
Exactly. Okay. Interesting. Okay, let's talk about pacing really quick. And because you're such a prolific mountain bike coach, I thought you'd be the perfect person to ask this question. And I've actually had a really hard time finding an answer to this question. And I do a ton of research on this stuff. But if you look at triathlon or even shorter distance racing, there's a lot of really good pacing information out there. So for example, if you're going to go do an Ironman, you might aim to hold 75 to 80% of your FTP. A half Ironman might be 80 to 85%. And obviously for a 40K TT, you're going to hold about your threshold. But I haven't been able to find really good information for mountain bike races. And I think there's a few factors that make it challenging. Obviously, there's the variability of mountain bike races, specifically cross country. There's also a lot of elevation changes that mountain bikers will experience in races like Leadville. And those are really, really long events. So can you give us your best pacing advice on mountain bike races at different distances? So maybe talk about like a cross country race and then a race like a Leadville. How would you advise somebody to pace a race like that?
So do you want me to just give you the information? So if you were racing on Sunday and I didn't know you,
right,
and I didn't know how much you trained, and you said, "Hey, I'm going I'm going to go in a race on the weekend that's going to take me at least 5 hours."
Yep.
Then I would say, I would probably quickly tell you to not exceed 83% of your max heart rate for the first third of the event.
Okay.
I would probably tell you not to exceed 86 or 7% for the middle third of the event. And I'd ask you to ask yourself how much gas you have in the tank with the experience you have about yourself, and now try to time trial the last third.
Interesting. And
now for some people, that might mean they have to get off and walk to not go above 80%.
Okay. Yeah.
But how many people walk at the end of a long mountain bike race? Because we're talking about regular people, right? Not the top 5%.
Well, you do regular people and then the top 5%.
Yeah. So I've seen top 5% be in the big ring at the start, and there's when we used to have granny rings in the granny ring in the end. So that's theoretically walking on your bicycle in relative terms.
Okay. Yeah.
So, I mean, you want generally 85 to 88% is a pretty good ceiling to put on someone to hold them back pretty much over 2.5 hours. Now, there's a lot of factors in how much aerobic training you have and how much muscular aerobic training you've done. Like, so I would do a lot of tempo at 60, 50 RPM. So, I would try to develop a lot of muscular strength in a person's aerobic abilities, because when you have to go do, it doesn't matter whether it's a stage race in the Eastern US or Leadville, like climbs are going to be 30 to 2 hours long.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I always ask people, like, if it's a 2-hour climb, is it going to be at threshold? No. If it's a 45-minute climb and there's 4 of them, will it be at threshold? No, probably not. So then it becomes this endurance tempo event for most of us.
Okay.
Even really good recreational people. So I generally see the whole 87, 88% max heart rate place is a pretty good spot to start because people will get to 97% in the first 7 minutes. And
that's not good.
No, but you can't fix that. It's too late unless you sit on the curb for 20 minutes. Well, it's true. You can't. But what happens in racing is people go out too hard, but then they keep riding with everybody until they're like out of gas and you can't jam any more gels down your throat. Like it's too late. So I try to get people to pick events that are similar so they can practice going out slower than they should to finish feeling as strong as they could, and then work backwards from the finish line and start going harder earlier until they finally get to the start line.
Yep.
Because when you go out too hard and you bonk, you don't know, like it's nearly impossible to figure out what too hard was and when.
Exactly. Okay.
And So
really what you're saying, I mean, if I think of my numbers, I'm 198, right? And then if you say 85% roughly, I'm just going off ballparks here. We're looking at, what's that, like 170-ish? So that's about my threshold. So you're saying even for these longer races, you can hold close to threshold or just below it for a very long time.
Well, I don't want to tell you to go do Leadville and hold that heart rate. But you have to remember, like, your heart rate's going to be at threshold, but you might only be pushing tempo power.
Right, because of the elevation.
Elevation, it could be many things.
Fatigue,
anxiety, fatigue, dehydration. So, but another thing because we've been talking about lots of different softwares that are all power based, right?
Yeah.
I had the first power meter on a mountain bike in Canada.
Did you really?
I've been using power meters forever. So I'm a huge believer in power.
Okay.
But when you look at a mountain bike race and you go look at it in whatever your software of choice is, and you look at the power line and the heart rate line, which one's flatter?
Oh, the heart rate.
Right. So if you took like somebody who doesn't know anything about cycling and you showed them a heart rate curve and you showed them a power curve, and you ask that person, which one of these do you think I should try to pace myself off of? I bet you they'd pick heart rate.
Yeah.
So the other thing is it's learning what your ceiling is and what your average is. And I can say that I learned this in cross-country skiing, and maybe you can go go back and look on some of your great races. Go back and look at some of your good, anybody out there. Go
Yeah.
look at some of your best races. And I've actually done this with a national level athlete a long time ago. Look at your best events where you felt awesome and had good results for yourself, and then go look at your worst ones. And all you're going to do is make a spreadsheet of the average heart rate of the event and the max heart rate of the event. And look at the discrepancy of both, and also look at the average and the max. And if you want to get fancy, you can see when the max happened. So the highest heart rate should come at the end.
That's really smart.
So just take old data and look, and I guarantee you a few interesting things will happen. Now, this is fairly general, but works 80 to 85% of the time. Most people should have approximately a 8 to 10 beat difference between average and max on a well-performed paced event.
That's smart. That's really, really smart. I like that.
Okay.
It's funny you say that, because if you think about it, if you look at a bad race or think about the guy who says, I biked so well in this triathlon, but I couldn't run. I'm like, dude, you went too hard on the bike, right? So that makes a lot of sense.
And you can do the same thing. I've done the same thing at the swim, bike, run. I've looked at all three sports and done it because I've coached a few people that have come. I don't know. I think I had a third at an Ironman once, believe it or not, and fifth.
Nice.
So I've had a few people do it with some success, and those were pros. So and same thing. Like you have to look at the whole event, which I'm sure people do. And figure out where to relax and where to take away and where to add, so you have this nice long perfect average.
Okay, perfect. All right, we're getting a little close on time for you here, so let's do this. One last, our main question that we ask every guest. It's called the Watt Point question, and the idea of this question is if the listener takes all of the advice that you gave them during the episode, how many watts is that worth? And we always use a guy with an FTP of 300 watts just to make it easy. But so let's say that you have the guy that we described at the beginning of this show shows up, he's got a 300 watt FTP, and you get him for, let's say, a 2-year period. How many watts is that worth?
Well, I'm going to say, I'm sorry, I'll go around a circle on the answer. So I think that the watts might actually be the same. So maybe my advice might be 0 watt points.
Okay.
However, I would look deeper and say, but at what percentage of your current wattage might I get out of you 2 years from now? So my watt points might actually be 0, but I could sustain the same person's wattage for way more time. Because so if you have a 300 watt, in my world, if you have a 300 watt FTP,
yep,
and an aerobic system of 150, and I can turn your aerobics, and I can max fat, and I can turn your max fat into 260 watts and keep you at 300. You are a very different rider in an event.
Okay, so let's say you got a guy who comes to you. He's 150, right? Yeah. He's got a 300 watt FTP, but you called it max fat.
Yeah, so basically what wattage do you push when you're utilizing fat the most in your system?
Okay. How much can you add to that in 2 years?
I've added 100 watts to that in 7 months.
Are you serious?
So, yeah, like I have people who don't burn fat, right? So that means when they start a test, they are 80% carbohydrate burners. And then through some nutrition manipulation, nothing crazy, don't have to go keto, you don't have to eat a stick of butter, but because there's a place for that, don't get me wrong, but people always think when you start talking about fat burning so remember that we can only store so many carbohydrates in our body, and we can only eat so much before we get sick.
Correct.
Doesn't matter how long we race. So if you become a better fat burner, you're actually really just staying away from burning carbs until you really need them. So that is how one of the biggest ways I make people faster is I give them more utilization of their 300 watt FTP.
And do you do that with training, primarily, or nutrition?
Yeah, because training, which is I think probably why I love having a heart rate ceiling. So someone might be able to handle doing tempo at 250 watts, but they might go above my heart rate ceiling of, about 83% of max while they do that. So then what I will do is have them now switch over to heart rate during the interval.
Okay.
So once again, there'll be some degradation near the end of the interval. Say they're doing 2 by 45 minutes of tempo at 250.
Yep.
They do the whole first interval, 250, 82% ceiling. Awesome. Second one, they have to shave the power to not go above heart rate.
Yep.
Well, I keep them there until they can do 2 by 45. Now, some people would, first the thing they do, and I get this all the time from my athletes, so, hey, can we do 255 now, or can we try 260? And I'm like, no. we're gonna try 2 by 60. And so I am sharing things I do, like 2 by 60, 4 by 30, 3 by 45. So they all sound really long, but even if you do a 15-minute warm up and 75 minutes of tempo properly 3 days a week, you'll really develop your aerobic system.
That's crazy. Okay, and then those numbers, that 83%, is this based on your MAP test, or where do you come up with that number?
Yeah, that's just me over time looking at, like, with a metabolic cart and with lactate, I generally find that people's tempo abilities are around that heart rate. And where I believe the power-based thing goes wrong is, because I actually don't believe a lot of the power people don't use heart rate as well. They just don't talk about it.
Okay.
But that's an aside. So I just, you can see this in lots of things. You can see this in respiration rate changing. You can see this in heart rate changing. You can see heart rate variability changing. So if you look at a whole bunch of things while a person holds power, I was always taught by my mentor to try to keep everything in a bit of a nice homeostasis.
Okay.
So I don't know, try to ride at 70, do an MAP test, ride at 75% of that fixed power and try to do it for an hour.
Okay.
Because based on what a lot of people say, that should be your threshold, or
Right.
very close to it. But just give it a try, and then you can even send me the heart rate file, and
I can't. It's almost impossible to do it.
Well, it shouldn't be, but that's because your aerobic. What that means is that your aerobic system is below 75%, and I'd like to get it above that.
Interesting.
Some people can't do 12 minutes, right? So here's the thing I always say about, like, cardiac drift. If you give a relatively new 1 to 2 year cyclist 1 hour at 75% of MAP by power, their heart rate will be like above VO2 max training in about 20 minutes. So I always think, what if someone who knew what they were doing walked in and saw this workout, and they didn't see the power numbers, but they saw the heart rate, and they saw the person's face was red and their ventilation was really, really noticeable. And you said, what kind of workout are they doing right now? Like it's
VO2 max. Yeah.
VO2 max, except, but you give that to somebody else and they'll be at 80% of their max heart rate, and they'll be breathing at 20 breaths a minute, and they'll be doing tempo. That's the aerobic system having this. So when you asked about watt points, if I move someone's, and it's funny because the guy we've been, relating a bit of his information, since I met him, his threshold's gone down 30 watts, but he hasn't lost a race yet. And this is a very competitive person because his fat burning state is now 270 watts of his 310, where before it was 230 watts of 330.
And where did he start with you?
He started at about 230 watts of fat burning and a 338 watt threshold. And now he's at 310 threshold and about 270 watts of fat burning.
But he can hold that 270 for 5-6 hours.
He can for sure hold 300 for 2.5 to 3 hours. And
wow.
And 270, haven't been in a situation to test it because everything's been under 3 hours. So I don't want to speculate, but he could for sure ride at 250 to 260 watts without cracking 80% of his max heart rate. So steady for 3 to 4 hours.
That's fascinating. Okay. Oh man, this is an amazing podcast. This is honestly, we've done a lot of these. This is one of my favorites. This is some very interesting information. Thank you. This is awesome.
You're welcome. Good.
So where can, my brain is going 100 miles an hour right now. Where can people learn more about you and what you do? How can we promote what you do on the show?
I don't know. I think this is going to be the start of it because you probably can't find anything about me.
I know it's hard. I've tried, and I'm good at that.
So I know you are. So yeah, I mean, we do offer all of the testing at the cycling gym. So, quickly, I won't go into that. I won't do it quickly. So we do offer all the services at the cycling gym. Some of the services can be done, so quickly, if you wanted to say, if you had a power meter and you wanted to get an Exert account, then you could book consultation time with me privately.
Okay.
And so how to set it up, because it's not easy. And then to use it aerobically like I do is very different than say even the way they might promote it.
Okay.
Inside testing is something else that that I do remotely. So I have a few people even in Switzerland they would do the protocol and send me the numbers, and then I would run their test for them, because it's something that they can either buy their own lactate analyzer, which sounds weird, but it's $500 or $600.
I have one.
Yeah, well, you do, but everyone runs out and spends a ton of money on their bicycles, right?
I know.
But if you did a test on yourself and sent me the data, then you can really start to identify what kind of athlete are you, and are you doing the right kind of training? So I think consultation, depending on what some people can have access to labs and get my protocols done, and then just have the lab send me the spreadsheet, and I've done that before, where I go through people's metabolic test information with them on the phone.
Okay.
So basically all the testing I can do should be able to be found somewhere. It isn't always easy to find a reputable. I find I sometimes get bad data, and then people are like, well, wait a second, I just paid a university to do this. And then they see where the bad data lies.
Yeah.
So, most of our stuff is in person. We don't really have anything online. There always is. There's always private coaching. I mean, that is something that, currently I don't ever coach more than 10 people. So right now I only have 2 spots. I do only like to coach people when I can help them fully, because I do find that's where the biggest difference lies. A lot of people think they have a lot of experience, but then my argument be, then why are you plateaued?
Right.
So, I mean, that's awesome. They have a lot of experience, but maybe you need someone with experience to help tweak your experience to make it better and find your watt points.
Exactly.
Yeah. So sorry, I'm not too alive on the internet. Maybe this will be the start of something, you never know.
Okay, cool. So thecyclinggym.com is your studio, right?
Yeah. Andrew Randall's my partner, and he's like an ex-national champion skinny roadie guy, and I'm a chubby mountain biker dude, and we have a lot of fun there.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much. This is fascinating.
Yeah, no
I'm going to go do a ton more research based on what you just told me, but thank you, okay. And we'll talk soon.
Okay, thank you.
All right, have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Be sure to listen to episode 28 for an interview with Today's Plan to learn how analytical training software can help you become a faster cyclist. If you enjoyed the show, please help us by sharing our podcast and by leaving a rating or review. If you want to learn more about our company, FLO Cycling, please visit us online at flocycling.com. That's F as in Frank, LOCYCLING.com. You can also find us under FLO Cycling on Facebook and Instagram. Until next time, ride safe.